Some children grow up in love, but Elly grew up in the freezing silence of being unseen, brought home from the hospital like a miracle, yet 6 years later locked in a basement like she never existed. One night, she was left outside in the rain, punished for drawing herself on the family tree. Because they said she wasn't a real Henderson. But no one expected that the child they tried to erase would be the one to bring their empire to its knees. And when the storm passed, she had written her name back into the space they'd tried to erase. Hit that subscribe button to follow our gripping emotional storytelling series, where family secrets unravel and justice is reclaimed, one voice at a time. My name is Karla Winters, and by the time I turned 34, I thought I'd finally figured out the rhythm of survival. Not happiness, no, that was a luxury I never quite reached, but the discipline of moving forward. Every day I woke before dawn, drank my coffee black and bitter, and drove 37 minutes down winding back roads to St. Jude's Medical Center, where I worked the night shift in the pediatric ward. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even consistently hopeful, but it gave me structure, purpose, and escape. The town I lived in, Millbrook, population 4209, was one of those places people either never left or never wanted to find. Cracked sidewalks, a diner that only served breakfast past noon, church bells every Sunday morning, even if the pews were empty. It was quiet, predictable, almost cruel in its stillness. I rented a small 2-bedroom cottage at the edge of town, with ivy creeping up its brick walls like fingers from the past trying to find purchase. The second bedroom had sat unused for months, then years. I always thought maybe someday it would be an office or a reading room or something that didn't remind me of what I didn't have. But everything changed the day I got the call. It was a Thursday, 2:47 p.m. I remember because I was eating a granola bar in the supply closet, hiding from a mother who insisted her son needed a CT scan for a scraped knee. The phone buzzed once, twice, 3 times. Unknown number. I answered with the same tired tone I used for telemarketers and insurance reps. Miss Winters, the voice on the other end, was small, brittle, like it had forgotten how to speak grief. "This is Sheriff Harold from Mason County. I'm sorry to inform you. My sister, Lindsay, dead. Ovarian cancer, stage 4. She hadn't told anyone, not even me. And just like that, I wasn't just a sister mourning a sibling. I was now the legal guardian of her 2-year-old daughter, Elly. I hadn't seen Elly since she was 6 months old. Last time Lindsay met me at a rest stop halfway between our towns. She looked pale thin, but still smiled when Elly gurgled from the car seat. We talked for 23 minutes. Then she vanished from my life without warning, explanation, or goodbye. I drove 4 hours that night to pick up a child I barely knew from a foster facility that smelled like pine disinfectant and wet cereal. When the social worker placed her in my arms, she was wearing a yellow hoodie 3 sizes too big and holding a chewed-up plastic giraffe. Her hair was tangled. Her eyes were blank. She didn't cry, not once. That scared me more than if she had screamed. Bringing Elly home felt like kidnapping a ghost. She floated through the house, silently touching things with a kind of awe, like nothing had ever belonged to her. I didn't have a crib. I didn't know how to make toddler meals. I burned the first 3 attempts at oatmeal. She slept curled up on the couch the first night despite the bed I made. When I tried to carry her to the second bedroom, she kicked and clawed until I set her down. I sat outside her door until sunrise, just to be sure she was still breathing. The early months were chaos in slow motion. Diaper rashes, night terrors, a screaming fit at the grocery store that left me sobbing in the produce aisle. I read every book I could find on trauma bonding, early childhood grief, and single parenting. Nothing prepared me. No textbook mentioned the guilt of yelling at a child who just wanted to be held, or the hollow weight of pretending you weren't overwhelmed when you were one bad day away from unraveling. But Elly changed me. Not with words, she didn't speak more than a whisper until she was nearly 3, but with presence. With the way she'd lean her head against my shoulder when the cartoons ended. The way she'd tug at my shirt hem when she needed a snack, but didn't want to ask. Slowly, the silence between us softened. She started humming to herself when coloring. She laughed once when the cat chased her sock. I cried when I heard it. By the time she turned 4, she called me Mama. I wasn't. Not really. Not biologically. But it didn't matter. She was mine in the only ways that counted. We built routines, shared toothbrush songs, late-night storybooks, weekend walks by the riverbank. She liked to pick up rocks and pretend they were treasure. I told her everyone had magic if she believed in it enough. I worked the graveyard shifts so I could be there when she woke up. I slept on the couch so she'd feel braver falling asleep in her own bed. I skipped dates, declined promotions, turned down every offer that would have sent me farther than a few minutes away from her. And yet even in that fragile piece we built, life had one more twist to carve through us. It was a Thursday again. The hospital was in chaos. A bus crash had sent 10 injured into the ER. I was stitching up a 7-year-old boy's arm when the door flew open and he walked in. Tall, confident, midnight blue scrubs, a voice like control itself. "I'm Dr. Thomas Henderson," he said, snapping on gloves without looking at anyone. "Show me the internal bleeds. There are people you notice because they demand attention." Thomas didn't. He didn't need to. He moved through the chaos like he belonged in it. Sharp features, sharp tone. His eyes met mine across the sterile white floor. "Winter's right, pediatric trauma." I nodded, wordlessly. I hated the way my stomach flipped. He was good, too good. He saw things before others did, moved fast, made decisions faster. I hated that I admired him within an hour. Over the next few weeks, I told myself to stay away. He was the kind of man who didn't have to flirt to win. Women noticed him before he spoke. Nurses lingered. But he kept coming back to pediatrics, asking for updates, handing me coffee at the start of my shift without ever asking how I took it. He just knew. One night, I found a note slipped into the locker room. "I heard Elly likes blue rocks." I saw this one and thought of her. It was a small sky blue pebble, smooth and cool to the touch. Elly called it her lucky stone. She carried it everywhere for weeks. That was the moment he crossed the line between doctor and something else. Our first date wasn't really a date. We met outside the break room and didn't stop talking until 2 hours after our shift ended. He told me about growing up as the youngest son in a legacy family, the Hendersons of Northwood Ridge. His great-grandfather founded the town's first hospital. His father sat on the board of trustees. His mother hosted fundraising galas. He'd been to private schools, studied at Johns Hopkins, had offers from New York and Chicago, but came home instead. "I like quiet places," he said, sipping his tea. "They tell the truth more slowly, but more clearly." I told him about Elly, about Lindsay, about the day I became a mother without planning it. He didn't flinch. "I don't want perfect," he said simply. "I want real." I didn't believe him, not at first. But over time, he earned something I hadn't given anyone in years: my trust. Elly adored him. He never tried too hard, never forced his presence. Just appeared like he belonged. He let her use his stethoscope, brought her coloring books, sat through 3 reruns of Frozen without complaining. Once I caught him letting her braid his hair with sparkly clips. 6 months into dating, he gave her a necklace, a tiny silver pendant engraved with her name, and a single word: forever. I cried harder than she did when he gave it to her. That night, he knelt in front of both of us and said, "I'm not just asking you to marry me, Karla. I'm asking both of you to be my family." I said yes before my heart even caught up. And so the name Elly Henderson was written on papers and rings in the margins of our dreams. I didn't know, as I tucked her into bed that night, still clutching the necklace, that the name would one day be erased. Not by accident, but by deliberate, chilling choice. But that came later. This was still the beginning. And beginnings by their nature are liars. I didn't know he'd planned anything. That night started like any other spaghetti for dinner. Elly at the table, humming some made-up tune while coloring a princess with purple hair. Thomas came home late, still in scrubs, exhausted, but smiling like the day had belonged to him. He kissed me on the forehead, ruffled Elly's curls, and asked if we wanted to go for ice cream. It was January. "Who eats ice cream in winter?" I asked, laughing. "People in love," he said, dead serious. We drove to Lake Glen, where snow crusted the ground in patches, and fog curled around the bare branches like ghosts whispering secrets. There was a small wooden gazebo at the edge of the lake, half lit by the moon. He led us there, Elly clinging to my side in her oversized coat. Inside the gazebo there were candles. Dozens. Someone, maybe one of the nurses from his department, had strung them around like constellations flickering against the dark wood. There was a folded quilt on the bench, a little box wrapped in silver ribbon. Thomas knelt. I didn't cry right away. It was too surreal. He opened the box, and inside were 2 things: a simple platinum ring and a child's bracelet. A delicate chain of silver with one word engraved into its curved plate. Elly Henderson. He looked at me first. Karla Winters, he said. You've held me accountable in ways no one else has. You've made me believe in permanence in building instead of fixing. I want to do this life with you. Then he turned to Elly. Her eyes were wide, uncertain. She held Mr. Elephant, her bedtime plush, like a shield. Elly Thomas said softer now. This isn't just for your mom, it's for you too. You're not just part of our story, you are the story. If you'll let me, I'd be honored to be your family. He offered her the bracelet like it was made of light itself. Elly didn't say anything. She just nodded and clutched the bracelet so tightly her knuckles turned white. That was the moment I said yes. Not to the ring, not to the man, but to the idea that maybe, just maybe, we could be something real. 2 months later, we were married. It wasn't a grand wedding. Not in the traditional sense. No hotel ballroom, no champagne tower. But the Henderson estate had its own grandeur, the kind carved into old brick and century-old windows where every photograph on the wall had a name and story attached. The ceremony was in the garden just as winter broke into reluctant spring. Dogwoods blooming white like forgiveness. Elly was the flower girl. She scattered petals with such care as if placing each one was a wish. Thomas's mother, Helen, wore navy blue and a string of pearls that looked like they could crush a neck. She smiled during the ceremony, smiled when the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, smiled when we kissed, but her eyes never touched Elly. After the ceremony, she approached with a wine glass and a brittle smile. Elly was very well behaved, she said, quite poised, for a little one who didn't grow up in our world. I brushed it off. One comment, maybe nerves, maybe generational gaps. Thomas didn't notice. He was too busy introducing me to second cousins and board members and family friends who spoke in country club code. Oh, you're the nurse, one of them said with a tone that somehow made nurse sound like a hobby. Thomas always had a generous heart. I smiled through it all. I'd been poor before. I'd been invisible. This wasn't new, but I reminded myself this was about us. Our unit. Me, Thomas, and Elly. We were carving space in the granite fortress of legacy, and I was prepared to dig. We moved into the Henderson estate that same week. It was a behemoth of a home columns and crown molding and fireplaces in rooms no one used. There was a library bigger than our entire old cottage. Elly called it the castle, and for a while she loved it. Her bedroom overlooked the garden. She had shelves now, real shelves for all her books and stuffed animals. I painted one wall sky blue, the same shade as the stone Thomas gave her when we first met. She slept better, ate more, laughed louder. I started to believe this was working. But Helen visited often, too often. She came with monogrammed bags and unsolicited advice. Elly should sit straighter at dinner, she'd say. Elly's handwriting is charming, but she might need a tutor. It was never cruel, never loud, but always invasive. Once Elly drew a picture of our family, me, Thomas, and her, all holding hands. She showed it to Helen. Helen blinked at it. That's very sweet, dear, but you forgot to draw your real mommy. Elly came into the kitchen after that and threw the picture in the trash. When I found it later, crumpled and damp from the coffee grounds, my chest burned. I confronted Helen the next morning. She's grieving, I said. She doesn't need confusion. Helen didn't flinch. I'm simply reminding her of where she comes from. She comes from us now. Helen's lips thinned. She's not a Henderson. Not really. You know how this family works, Karla. Lineage is delicate. I should have walked out then, but I stayed, because I thought I could shield Elly with proximity, with presence. If I was near, they couldn't get to her. I was wrong. The subtle rejections started early. Family gatherings where Elly's name wasn't printed on place cards. Group photos where she was asked to stand just slightly to the side. Thomas's aunt once leaned over during brunch and asked, "So what does she call you, Miss Karla or Mommy?" Elly was sitting right there. She looked at her eggs, said nothing. I brought it up to Thomas that night. He wrapped an arm around me. It's generational, he said. They don't mean anything by it. But Elly feels it. She's strong. That's not the point. He kissed my temple and said, I love both of you. That's what matters. And for a while that was enough to dull the ache, until the word foster showed up. It slipped from Helen's mouth one afternoon when her friends visited for tea. Elly had just walked into the room holding a book. Oh, that's Karla's foster daughter, Helen said casually. Elly stopped mid-step. She didn't say anything, just turned around and left. That night, when I tucked her in, she asked, "Am I going to have to go live with someone else now?" It took everything in me not to cry. "No," I said, "never." "Then why don't they call me granddaughter?" I had no answer. The next morning, the bracelet Thomas gave her was sitting on the nightstand, unworn. She didn't wear it again for weeks. By the time Thomas noticed, I'd already started to document every moment, every remark, every omission. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust what love could overlook when it was too comfortable. Because what they were doing wasn't loud. It was quiet. And quiet, I'd learned, was where the most dangerous things festered. The Hendersons called her the child. Never Elly, never sweetheart, never my granddaughter, just the child. And though she was sleeping in the room down the hall, they made sure she knew she wasn't really in the family. Not in the way that mattered to them. Not in blood. But blood, I would learn, is just the beginning of what people weaponize when they want to erase someone. I didn't start working night shifts because I wanted to. It was necessity, not ambition. Elly had just started school, and Thomas's practice was expanding. My hospital offered a raise if I switched to overnight pediatric trauma, and it meant I could still be home in the afternoons to help with homework, cook dinner, brush her hair into a braid she liked too tight. I told myself I was doing it for her. For stability, for the future. But the future doesn't care why you make choices. It only measures their weight. 3 nights a week became 4, then 5, sometimes 6. 12-hour shifts that blurred one sunrise into the next. I left the house just after Elly's bedtime and returned when the birds started calling the day in. She'd be eating breakfast at the island while Thomas scrolled through emails. I'd kiss her hair, press a coffee into his hand, and try not to let my fatigue show. "You're doing too much," he said once. "You're not doing enough," I almost said back. Instead, I smiled and told him I liked staying busy. It was during one of those rotations that things began to change. Subtly, quietly, like all dangerous things. I came home one morning to find Elly's bedroom light off. Not unusual, but her blanket was folded, her pillow untouched. I assumed maybe she'd crawled into our bed the night before, frightened of a storm or a nightmare. But the bed was untouched. She was in the guest room, lying on top of the sheets, still wearing the same pajama set I'd left her in the night before. "Hey, sweetheart," I whispered. "Why didn't you sleep in your room?" Her eyes flicked up to mine. I got moved. Moved. She nodded. "Grandma Helen said I was being noisy, so I had to go where I wouldn't disturb anyone." It sounded plausible. Helen hated loudness, chaos, anything that cracked the porcelain perfection of her world. But the next time I worked an overnight shift, I got suspicious. Elly's room was dark again, cold, still. I checked the guest room. Empty. Panic bloomed. I searched the bathrooms, the hallway, the linen closet. Nothing. Then I opened the basement door. It creaked like in every horror movie, too loud, too slow, too final. The air shifted, heavier, colder, damp with forgotten things. And there, curled up on an old mattress with a thin fleece blanket, was my daughter. My 8-year-old daughter. Sleeping in the basement. The sight sucker punched me. I didn't call her name. I just stood there, one hand gripping the doorknob so tightly my knuckles popped. She stirred, opened one eye. "Mom, why are you down here?" She blinked, confused by the question. "Because I was told to." "By who?" "Elena and Grandma." I was loud again, and they said it was disrespectful to slam doors. "Elly, you didn't slam any doors." "I think I did. Maybe I forgot." "I don't know. I didn't mean to." Her voice grew small, shrinking into herself. I led her upstairs and bathed her without another word. Later, when I confronted Thomas, he brushed it off. "They're strict, Karla, but they're trying to teach her structure. She's 8, not a soldier. She's not being hurt. Sleeping in a basement isn't normal. She's not complaining. She shouldn't have to." He kissed my cheek, told me I was tired, that maybe I was projecting, that I worked too many hours to see things clearly. He said it gently. That was the most dangerous part. The next week, I brought Elly with me to the hospital for an afternoon event. Nurses' Appreciation Day. Balloons, cake, face painting. The kind of chaos she loved. She clung to my hip the whole time. Wouldn't speak unless spoken to. Wouldn't smile unless prompted. My coworkers noticed. "She's gotten quieter," one said. "She used to be sunshine." I brushed it off. School stress. But it gnawed at me. The next sign came at dinner. Sunday roast, Thomas's specialty. Roasted potatoes, carrots, duck glazed in orange. Everyone had a plate. Except Elly. She sat at the far end of the table with a bowl of oatmeal. Bland, lumpy, cold. Elly, why aren't you eating what we're eating? I asked. She looked up, then down. I had bad manners this morning. I didn't say thank you after breakfast. So this is my punishment. I looked to Helen, then Elena Thomas's cousin, who had moved in temporarily, with her own daughter, Ivy. Neither looked at me, neither denied it. Elly, go wash your hands. We'll fix you a proper plate. She hesitated. I'm not supposed to. You are now. She left the room. Thomas cut his meat. Karla, don't! We're trying to raise her right. You're trying to raise her to disappear. That night, he slept in the guest room. The next few days were strained, controlled like a house of glass that knew the hammer was coming. But the final straw didn't come from Helen or Elena or Thomas. It came from Ivy. She was Elly's age, just a few months older. They should have been best friends. But they weren't. Ivy was already molded prim, polite, condescending in a way only children taught hierarchy can be. One evening, I overheard her say, "You're lucky. My mom says you could have ended up in a shelter. At least here you get food." Elly didn't respond, just walked away. When I asked her about it later, she said, I think she's right. I asked Thomas again, pressed him. His answer, Karla, they're trying to help her. This family has traditions, standards. She's not used to that. Standards don't require cruelty. She's not being abused. She's being erased. He sighed, rubbed his temples. You're making this harder than it needs to be. That was when I knew. He'd chosen his side, and it wasn't ours. A few nights later, Elly came into my room after another shift. Mom, yes, baby. If I was your real daughter, would they be nicer to me? I froze. She continued almost absent-mindedly. Grandma said I'm like a guest. Guests don't get to pick dinner, or where they sleep, or if they belong in the picture. I pulled her into my lap, felt her ribs through the thin cotton of her pajamas. You are my real daughter, I said, but not theirs. No, I said honestly, not theirs, but that's their failure, not yours. She didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she'd already accepted that truth a long time ago. And I fool that I had only just begun to see it. The storm didn't arrive suddenly. It built all-day thick clouds, gathering like gossip in the sky, silent but looming. By the time Karla started her shift at St. Jude's that evening, the weather alert on her phone pinged with a yellow triangle, severe thunderstorm warning. She took a moment staring out the hospital's third-floor window. The wind shook the trees like they owed it money. Back home, Elly was supposed to be asleep by now, clean, warm, safe. Thomas had kissed her goodbye before Karla left. Said he'd handle dinner reading time lights out. Don't worry, he murmured, hand on her shoulder. We've got it under control. She believed him. For the first 2 hours of her shift, she was buried in back-to-back intakes. A toddler with a deep gash across her cheek. A boy who'd fallen from a tree. Then came the code blue, an infant born, too early, lungs too small. Karla held the crash cart steady while the neonatologist worked, barely blinking through the urgency. It wasn't until 10:43 p.m. that she checked her phone again. No messages. Not from Thomas, not from Elly. That should have been the first clue. Back at the Henderson estate, the house had slipped into a ritual of correction and punishment that Karla never saw, never would have imagined. But Elly had learned the rhythm. She knew how to move quietly, when to keep her head down, how to interpret silence as a warning. That evening after dinner, Helen had brought out a bundle of old papers, genealogical records of the Henderson family. Yellowing documents in plastic sleeves, scrolls of names written in perfect cursive with date stamps and annotations. Generations stretching back to colonial landowners, surgeons, judges. Elena's putting together a memory wall, Helen had explained. It's important to show where you come from. Real bloodlines. Elly had watched from the corner of the parlor, cradling her drawing pad. She liked letters, liked how they curved and swirled. She didn't understand lineage or bloodline pride, but she knew a beautiful symbol when she saw one. She wanted to try copying it. She asked first. Helen didn't answer. So, Elly crept forward, knelt by the edge of the ottoman, and began sketching. She drew vines curling around names, dots of light that looked like stars. She copied the H in Henderson with meticulous strokes, tongue pressed between her teeth. Elena found her 10 minutes later. Elly. The voice cracked like thunder itself. Elly jumped, marker streaking across the margin. You drew on the actual document, Elena hissed. I thought it was a copy. I just wanted to. You defaced our family records. Helen appeared in the doorway, wine glass in hand. Her gaze sharpened like glass under sunlight. She's disrespected the entire line. I told you she doesn't understand boundaries. I didn't mean, Elly's voice cracked. You think you belong here? Scribbling your name next to people who actually earned it. I wasn't, her hands trembled. Enough, Helen snapped. Go outside. Think about what you've done. Elly blinked. Outside. In the garden. Maybe the cold will teach you to be more careful. It wasn't a suggestion. Elena had already opened the back door. The rain had started thin and whispering like a secret. Helen poured another inch of Merlot and turned back to the fireplace. They never checked if she went. They never asked how long she stayed. Karla's shift was cut short at 11:32 p.m. The incoming trauma cases had been diverted to a larger facility nearby due to the storm. The ER settled into an eerie quiet, and the attending physician waved her off early. Go home. Get some sleep before the next hurricane hits. She drove slowly, windshield wipers slashing back and forth. The town was half drowned in mist. By the time she reached the Henderson estate, branches littered the driveway, and thunder cracked in the distance like bones snapping. Inside the house was too quiet. She didn't call out, just moved room to room. Elly's bedroom empty, guest room empty, study bathrooms done nothing. She checked the basement last. It was dark, dusty still. A crack of lightning lit the garden outside. That's when Karla saw it. A small figure curled beneath the rosebush near the back trellis. Barefoot, soaked, shaking. Elly, she screamed already, halfway out the back door. The wind yanked at her coat rein, slicing sideways. She reached the bush and dropped to her knees. Elly didn't even flinch. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, forehead pressed to her legs. The thin cotton nightgown she wore clung to her body like tissue paper. Her teeth chattered in staccato. Baby, 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 Karla whispered, scooping her up. Her body was ice. She weighed nothing. Inside, Karla stripped her out of the wet clothes, wrapped her in towels, started the shower to warm the bathroom air. She ran the water over Elly's feet first, then her hands. Still, the girl didn't speak. Not a word. Karla cradled her in a blanket, whispering into her ear like a chant. You're safe. You're safe. I've got you. I've got you. It took 15 minutes for the color to return to Elly's lips, 30 before she spoke. I wasn't supposed to come back in. Who told you that? Grandma and Elena. Karla froze. What did they say? They said, I didn't belong in the house, that I ruined the family tree. Karla sat very still. The rage built slowly this time, not an explosion, but a tide. Cold, relentless, unstoppable. She carried Elly to her own bed, layered her with blankets, heated a towel, and wrapped it around her small feet. Left the door cracked so light spilled in. And then Karla marched to the parlor. Thomas was there sipping tea, reading emails. He looked up surprised. You're home early. She was outside. What? In the garden, Thomas. In the middle of a thunderstorm. His brow furrowed. Why? Ask your mother. Ask Elena. Apparently drawing on a family chart is punishable by exposure. He stood. Okay, Karla, calm down. Don't tell me to calm down. What happened exactly? She was told to stay outside. Alone. Cold, wet. Punished. Like an animal. She must have misunderstood. She's 8, she was sobbing. Thomas pinched the bridge of his nose. You should have called if you were coming home. This could have been a misunderstanding. Karla blinked. You're upset I came home without notice. I just mean it's late, and emotions are high. We'll talk in the morning. Karla stared at him, and in that moment, she saw him differently. Not as the man she loved, but as the product of something older, something bred into bone. He didn't flinch at injustice because it looked familiar. Expected, necessary. You're right, she said coldly. We'll talk in the morning. But in her chest, something ruptured. A string cut loose from the idea of us. Because tonight proved it, they didn't see Elly as family. And Thomas, he didn't see her at all. The silence didn't arrive like a storm. It crept in like a fog under the door, unnoticed at first. Then one day, Karla realized Elly had stopped humming. She always hummed, always. Little songs with no tune. Snippets of movie themes. Sometimes just a vibrating note in her throat while coloring. But now? Nothing. No words in the car. No questions during dinner. No goodnight stories requested. Not even Mr. Elephant the plush she once demanded at bedtime, like oxygen seemed to matter anymore. He sat untouched at the foot of her bed, faded and slouched. Did something happen at school? Karla asked one evening, trying to braid Elly's hair like always. Elly shrugged. Elly, baby, you can tell me if someone was mean to you. Shrug. Karla finished the braid in silence, kissed her forehead, watched her walk to her room with her head down. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heartbeat ticking louder than the clock. She didn't want to admit it, but she'd felt it for weeks. Something had shifted. Not just fear, not sadness, something deeper. Elly had started folding into herself, and Karla couldn't reach her. The breaking point came on a Saturday, pancake morning. Elly didn't eat. Karla flipped one onto her plate. Your favorite, with strawberries. Elly looked at the plate, then back at Karla. Are strawberries expensive? Why? Grandma said I shouldn't expect expensive things. Karla's grip tightened around the spatula. When did she say that? Another shrug. Elly, please. She says I'm not really part of the family, so I shouldn't expect family food. Karla dropped the spatula onto the counter. It clanged like a gunshot. Thomas walked in a minute later, asking why there was tension. Ask your mother, Karla snapped. Thomas defended her, of course. Said Helen was traditional, that she didn't always filter herself, that Karla was reading too much into a generational misunderstanding. But Karla had lived too long with subtle cruelty to confuse it with tradition. She bought a small voice recorder that night, the kind designed for lectures or interviews. Thin, sleek, unassuming. She showed Elly how it worked. This is just to help me understand, Karla said. In case you hear something that doesn't feel kind. Elly stared at it. Will I get in trouble? No. Never. You're not the one doing anything wrong. She placed it behind a framed photo on Elly's desk. An old picture of the two of them on a carousel, both laughing. Back before the house had turned against them. For 3 days, nothing. Karla listened late at night, curled on the couch with headphones. Footsteps, muffled conversations, doors creaking. Elly whispering to herself. Then came the 4th night. And the voice, clear, measured, laced with disdain. Helen. Because real Henderson children know better than to touch fine china. Elly's voice, I just wanted to look. You wanted. You always want. But wanting doesn't make you one of us. You don't carry our blood. That's the difference. Silence. Then the unmistakable clink of a dish being pulled away. Elly again, I'm sorry. Helen, stop saying that. It's exhausting. It doesn't change who you are. Karla hit stop. Sat in the dark. Her heart pounding like war drums. She rewound. Played it again. Slower. It doesn't change who you are. You don't carry our blood. The sentence sat in her mouth like a shard of glass, cutting every time she swallowed. It wasn't about manners. It wasn't about rules. It was about lineage. It was about erasure. Karla didn't cry then. She stood, walked to the bathroom, splashed water on her face. But the tears came later, in the laundry room, sitting on the cold tile floor while the washer hummed beside her. Her chest cracked open with a grief too sharp to name. Not just for Elly, but for herself. Because she'd believed. She had believed them. Believed that if she loved enough, if she adapted, if she behaved, the family would eventually make space. But space hadn't been offered. Only te. Estás home. Sentin mad. She had handed Elly to them, thinking they would love her, and instead, they had clipped her wings and called it guidance. Later that night, Karla entered Elly's room. The girl was asleep, curled fetal, under a too-thin blanket, her hands tucked beneath her cheek, the recorder still blinking faint red behind the photo. Karla tucked it away, sat beside her, whispered, You don't have to prove anything to them. You don't have to shrink to fit in. Elly didn't stir, but Karla kept talking, to herself, to the dark, to the lies she'd let bloom under the banner of family. They don't get to define who you are. Not anymore. It started with a name Karla barely remembered, Rosa Mejia. She had worked at this Henderson estate for 6 years, soft-footed and mostly invisible, in the shadow of crystal chandeliers and cold family brunches. Rosa had always been kind to Elly. She spoke to her in gentle Spanish when no one else bothered to listen. And then one day, without warning, she was gone. Family emergency, Thomas had said at the time. She needed time off, Helen echoed. But Karla remembered the look on Rosa's face the last time she'd seen her tight-lipped, hollow-eyed, like someone who'd watched something wrong and knew she could do nothing to stop it. After the audio recording confirmed her worst fears, Karla went digging. It took 3 days of calls to finally get through to Rosa. Her number was disconnected, and the agency that originally hired her wouldn't confirm where she went. But Karla was persistent. She found a cousin on Facebook, sent a message, then waited. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Karla, Rosa. There was silence, then a breath. I thought you'd never call. They met at a coffee shop outside Millbrook, far from the eyes and ears of the estate. Rosa looked older, more tired. She wore her hair shorter, clothes looser, like she wanted to disappear inside them. but her eyes were the same watchful, warm, burdened. Karla didn't waste time. Something happened with Elly, didn't it? Rosa didn't answer right away. She just stared into her tea. Then quietly she began. She was so sweet, so small, always tried to help. She'd follow me while I cleaned, asked questions. One day, she said she wanted to grow up to be a helper too. Like me. Karla swallowed the lump in her throat. I saw how the others treated her, like she was extra, not supposed to be there. The little one, what's her name, Ivy. She'd get cupcakes. Elly would get crusts. Ivy would break something, and Elly would get blamed. Karla's voice broke. Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to. I did. But Helen threatened my visa. Elena said she'd call ICE if I talked. I'm not even undocumented, but it didn't matter. Fear is enough. She paused. Then there was the day of the spill. Karla leaned in. What spill? Grape juice. Elly knocked over a glass. Not even on purpose, she tripped. Helen screamed, said she'd never amount to anything, told her to scrub it up, then made her clean the whole kitchen floor, on her hands and knees. No mop. Karla felt her hands clench. She cried. Quiet, but I saw it. When I tried to help, Helen told me it was a learning opportunity, said Hendersons need discipline, and if she wanted to pretend to be one, she'd better act like one. Rosa looked down. That night, I found her still scrubbing. Her knees were red, bleeding. I gave her ointment. The next morning, Helen scolded me for interfering. What else? Karla whispered. Rosa hesitated, then looked Karla dead in the eye. They locked her in the storage room. Karla's stomach dropped. She'd drawn on a napkin. Just doodle stick figures. Elena found it. Said it looked like Ivy being hurt. Elly tried to explain, but they said she was fantasizing about violence. So, they dragged her to the old linen closet, the one near the wine cellar. Locked her in. No lights, no blanket. Karla's voice was a whisper. How long? All day. Morning till dinner. I tried to open it once. Helen caught me. Said if I touched that door again, I'd be gone. So I quit the next week. Karla couldn't feel her fingers. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folder. Would you sign a statement? Rosa's eyes welled. Yes, I should have said something sooner. When Karla left the cafe, the rain had started again. A soft, persistent drizzle, like the sky knew and couldn't hold it anymore either. She spent the next 2 nights gathering evidence. She printed the audio file, took pictures of Elly's bruised knees she'd once documented for the pediatrician just in case. She pulled up a string of text messages from Helen, passive-aggressive reminders that Elly needed more polish. She annotated them, labeled them with dates, made copies. At 9:00 a.m. Monday morning, she made an appointment with Thomas's personal attorney, Victor Langston, a man she'd met at fundraisers, who'd once told her he admired how seamlessly she'd adapted into Henderson society. She wore her scrubs. No makeup, no performance. The receptionist greeted her with polite confusion. I need 10 minutes with Victor, Karla, said voice flat. She got 15. Victor's office was a cathedral of walnut paneling and leather furniture. He gestured to a seat already wary. I'm here about Elly, Karla said. He nodded slowly. Thomas mentioned there were concerns. I'm not here to vent. I'm here to ask a question. All right. Is she still in the will? Victor blinked. Excuse me. The Henderson Trust, the estate, the succession documents. Thomas made a big gesture when we married. Said Elly would be treated like any other child. I just want to know if that was true. Victor hesitated. Mrs. Henderson. Winters. Just answer the question. He adjusted his tie. There was an amendment. Quiet. About 5 months ago. Thomas filed it during a tax update. Elly's name was removed. On the basis that she wasn't blood. Karla sat perfectly still. Victor continued uneasy. He didn't announce it. Said it was temporary. Something about aligning documents for future planning. You were going through your new work contract at the time he didn't want to distract you. Karla nodded once, stood. Victor called after her. It's not too late to change it. I'm sure if you and Thomas talk. But she was already gone. Outside the sun had returned. But Karla had never felt colder. The dining room smelled of roasted rosemary chicken, fresh linen napkins, and the bitter tension of things unsaid. Karla sat across from Thomas at the long, lacquered mahogany table, the one Helen insisted came from a 19th century French estate, as if the table's bloodline mattered as much as their own. 2 candles flickered between them, casting uneven shadows across the white china and crystal goblets. Neither of them touched their food. It was late. Elly had already been sent to her room, excused after a quiet dinner where she barely lifted her fork. She had drawn a bird on her napkin and pencil and quickly folded it when Helen glanced her way. Karla waited until the silverware stopped clinking, until the clock on the wall ticked into the next hour. Then she spoke. "I talked to Victor Langston today." Thomas looked up slowly. "About, you know what about?" His eyes narrowed. He dabbed at his mouth with a cloth napkin, like this was just another disagreement over vacation plans. "That was confidential. You removed her, Thomas." He set the napkin down with deliberate precision. "I adjusted the legal structure. She's not a beneficiary of the Henderson Legacy Fund anymore. That's all." Karla's voice was ice. "You erased her. She was never legally entitled. She's your daughter. You gave her a bracelet with her name engraved on it. You stood in front of both of us and said we were your family. I said what needed to be said, at the time." At that moment, something fractured behind Karla's ribs. "You're unbelievable," she whispered. Thomas didn't flinch. "Karla, listen to me carefully. This family has standards. We have obligations, traditions, expectations. She's a child. She's not a Henderson. Not really. I'm sorry, but I never expected her to actually fit." Karla rose slowly. Her chair scraped the hardwood. "You're not sorry," she said. "No," he replied. "I'm practical. That's what keeps this family's name from becoming meaningless." The sound came before she even felt her hand move. A single clean slap. Thomas's head turned with the impact. His cheek reddened, but he didn't touch it. He just stared at her. "You've been waiting to do that for a long time," he said quietly. Karla's eyes burned not with tears, but with clarity. "I should have done it the first time you looked through her like she was wallpaper." She turned, walked to the stairs. "Where are you going?" Karla didn't answer. "Elly's asleep," Thomas called after her. "I'm waking her up," she said. "She's not sleeping under your roof again." They were halfway to the car, Elly barefoot wrapped in a fleece blanket, eyes dazed when the headlights cut through the driveway. 3 cars. Helen first in a navy coat with fur cuffs, lips pursed like she'd tasted vinegar. Behind her, Elena and 2 of Thomas's cousins, faces red from wine and self-righteousness. Even Robert Thomas's father had made the drive his silence as damning as ever. Helen marched up the walkway, heels clacking like gunshots. "What is the meaning of this, Karla?" Karla positioned Elly behind her. "You want to talk? Let's talk, right here." Thomas stepped onto the porch. "She's leaving." "She's kidnapping Elena," said voice sharp. "She's protecting," Karla snapped. "Something none of you ever did." Helen folded her arms. "You've embarrassed this family enough." "No, I'm just now starting. She's blowing this out of proportion." Thomas added more to the group than to her. She found some old audio and now thinks she's Nancy Drew. Karla took a breath. Her voice dropped into something surgical. "She knows about the grape juice, the forced cleaning, the locked room." The air shifted. "What room?" Helen said too quickly. "You locked her in a closet," Karla hissed, "like an animal." She was being disrespectful. "She's 8. She's dramatic. She cried herself to sleep on the floor of your basement." Silence. Robert cleared his throat. "I think we all need to calm down." "No," Karla said, stepping forward. "You want to know what this is really about?" No one answered. She pointed at Helen. "You taught your family that blood is the only currency, that love is conditional, that a child has to earn a seat at your table." Helen rolled her eyes. "Don't be so theatrical." "If love is about blood," Karla said, voice shaking now, "then tell me, how many times did you make my daughter bleed to prove she didn't have enough of it?" Gasps, shifts, eyes dropped. Elena stepped forward. "Karla, maybe this isn't the place." "No," Karla growled. "It is exactly the place." She dropped her voice-locked eyes with Thomas. "She loved you. She called you Dad. She wore that bracelet every night until she realized it didn't mean anything to you." Thomas's jaw clenched. "This family is a cage," Karla interrupted. "And I'm done pretending it's a castle." She opened the car door. Elly climbed in without a word. Before she shut the door, Karla turned to face the people who once claimed her. "Don't call. Don't come near her. Don't say her name if you can't say it with love." Then she drove into the dark. And not a single one of them tried to stop her. The morning after Karla left the Henderson estate, she sat across from a divorce attorney in a modest office on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but fury compressed into stillness. "I want out," she said simply. The attorney, Linda Marrow, sharp-eyed and no stranger to high-profile families, nodded pen already moving across the intake sheet. "Irreconcilable differences," Karla exhaled. "Emotional cruelty. systemic abuse, gaslighting, child endangerment. Linda raised an eyebrow. You're not hesitating. No, Karla said, steady now. Because the man I married doesn't exist, and the people who claim to be my family are a threat to my daughter's safety. Linda looked up, and the child Elly. I want an emergency protective order. Immediate. I don't want the Hendersons within 50 feet of her. Does she carry the Henderson surname legally? Yes. But that changes nothing. They treated her like a stray dog who scratched the furniture. Linda nodded again. We'll file simultaneously the divorce and the request for a temporary restraining order. If you have documentation, I have recordings, witness statements, photographs, a journal. Linda smiled, not kindly but professionally. Then they picked the wrong mother to underestimate. By noon, Karla had filed the paperwork. By sundown, a court clerk had reviewed the file and marked it urgent. Hearing requested. But that was only the beginning. Because in a town like Millbrook, where the Hendersons sat on museum boards, hosted charity galas, and had hospital wings named after them, accusations didn't fly under the radar. They ignited. And Karla didn't whisper. She told the truth with receipts. The day after the filing, the Department of Family and Child Services opened an investigation into the Henderson estate. 2 social workers arrived at Karla's temporary apartment, where she and Elly had taken refuge. Elly had been quiet for most of the morning, curled on the couch watching the window, as if afraid someone would find them. Karla sat beside her when the knock came. Miss Winters, the lead investigator asked, showing her badge. We're here regarding your daughter, Elly. Karla nodded. She knows why you're here. I've told her everything, but she's scared. The younger investigator, a woman named Joy, crouched to Elly's level. We're here to help, she said softly. And you don't have to talk if you don't want to. Elly looked up, then nodded once. They sat at the kitchen table. Elly cradled a chipped mug of cocoa while Karla sat out of earshot. Joy asked questions gently, but clearly trained not to guide but to open doors. What did it feel like living at the Henderson house? Like I was pretending. Pretending what? To be good enough. Did anyone hurt you? Elly's voice was small, not with hands, but with eyes, and silence. Joy glanced at her colleague. Did you ever feel afraid? Elly nodded. Can you tell me a time? There was one day. I spilled juice. Grandma Helen said I was too clumsy to ever be a real lady. That Hendersons don't spill. She made me scrub the floor, and I had to fist numbage before they got back from the park. Joy's voice lowered. Who went to the park? Everyone, just not me. Elly! Joy paused. Did you ever think about hurting yourself? Elly didn't answer right away. Then quietly, I thought maybe, if I wasn't there, no one would be mad anymore. Joy's pen froze. I didn't want to die. I just wanted to stop being the reason everyone sighed. That sentence landed in the room like a blade. Karla, sitting just outside the doorway, choked on her breath. 2 days later, the court convened for an emergency hearing. It was gray outside, rain again. Like the weather itself couldn't let go of the grief in the air. Karla stood before the judge with Linda beside her. The Hendersons. Thomas, Helen, Elena, even Robert sat on the opposite bench. Polished, prepared. Their attorney wore a navy suit and an expression of weary disbelief. The judge read over the file. I've reviewed the statements, the recordings, the child's testimony. He looked up. Has anyone on the respondent's side prepared a statement of defense? Helen rose. Your Honor, with respect, these are exaggerated claims from a woman clearly struggling to separate personal conflict from parenting judgment. We disciplined her, yes, but we did what any family would do. The judge's gaze didn't shift. Did you lock a child in a storage room for several hours without light or supervision? Helen opened her mouth. Closed it. Did you remove her from shared meals? Exclude her from family outings? She didn't appreciate. Yes or no, Mrs. Henderson? Silence. The judge turned to Thomas. Do you acknowledge filing an amendment to your estate, removing the child's name from legal succession? Thomas straightened. Yes, for legal clarity. Do you acknowledge telling your wife, quote, I never thought she'd actually become a Henderson? Thomas blinked. I didn't mean it that way. The judge leaned forward. Then let me be very clear. Your household, as presented in this file, failed this child in every moral and legal sense. The emotional trauma alone would warrant years of therapy, and your response to her pain is chilling. He signed the order. Effective immediately, all members of the Henderson family are barred from contact with Elly Winters. No phone calls, no letters, no gifts, no proximity within 50 feet. Gasps erupted. Helen stood. You can't be serious. I'm deadly serious, Mrs. Henderson. Karla didn't cry. She didn't breathe. She only looked at Elly, sitting with joy on the bench behind her. The girl clutched Mr. Elephant in one hand and a paper heart in the other. The heart had one word written in marker, shaky but proud. Mine. It began with a single headline: Heiress or hostage, shocking allegations against Henderson dynasty. The story dropped on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. It was tucked under the politics section. At first, another scandal involving another old money family. But the name Henderson carried weight. Their fortune, their lineage, their pristine reputation had made them untouchable for decades. Until now. By noon, it was everywhere. Local news anchors interrupted weather updates to report on the deepening controversy involving prominent physician Thomas Henderson and allegations of child endangerment filed by his wife, Karla Winters. Pictures surfaced of the estate of Thomas in his hospital scrubs of Helen at a charity gala, smiling under a diamond choker. But none of it compared to the one photo that began trending worldwide by 3 p.m. A little girl, sitting on a therapist's couch, holding a hand-drawn tree with names scrawled across it in crayon. Her name was missing, but then underneath the roots written in shaky but deliberate handwriting. Elly. I live here too. It went viral in 3 hours. By the end of the week, 3 separate media outlets launched full investigations into the Henderson family. Old employees came forward, maids, tutors, gardeners. Anonymous sources who described a house full of the control and hierarchy. One former nanny told a podcast, "You were either born a Henderson or you were tolerated as one." Karla gave one interview, just one. She sat across from a seasoned journalist in a modest studio. No makeup, no lighting tricks. "She's 8, Karla said. She didn't ask for their money. She didn't ask to be worshipped. She just wanted a chair at the table. And they made her feel like a trespasser in her own home." The clip hit 1 million views by morning. It wasn't long before regulators took notice. On Thursday, the Medical Review Board released a statement. Effective immediately, Dr. Thomas Henderson's license is suspended pending further review of his involvement in domestic child abuse allegations. The board finds sufficient preliminary evidence of ethical violations incompatible with the standards of pediatric care. Thomas didn't speak publicly. Not at first. His lawyers issued a cold defensive statement, but damage control came too late. His hospital cut ties within 48 hours. The charity board removed him. His alma mater rescinded an invitation for a keynote speech he'd been preparing for months. Behind closed doors, Helen panicked. She contacted publicists, attorneys, even a crisis management firm. They crafted a statement for her, measured, remorseful, vague enough to dodge liability. But Helen had other plans. She went on live television, sat beside a stone-faced anchor, and delivered words dipped in venom. "We tried to teach the child manners, discipline, standards. We opened our home. We showed her grace. She looked into the camera, not blinking once. And she repaid us with betrayal." The clip ricocheted across the internet like shrapnel. Comments flooded in. "You met a child, exposed your abuse. You taught her manners by locking her in closets. The Henderson bloodline is poisoned with cruelty." It only got worse. An old home video resurfaced Elly at age 5, holding up a drawing of a stick family. She says, "This is me and Mommy and Daddy Thomas," before adding, "I'm not in their tree, but Mommy says I can be a branch." That sentence alone spawned hashtags, "Let her be branch," "Elly's tree," "Erase the erasure." Meanwhile, Elly was watching it all unfold from a quiet therapist's office. Karla had shielded her from most of it. No social media, no TV news. But the world found its way in. One morning, Elly asked softly, "Mom, do I make things worse for people?" Karla turned from the sink dish towel in hand. "What? Everyone's mad. Because of me." "No!" Karla knelt. "People are mad because of what happened to you, not because you happened." Elly's eyes filled. "But I broke their family." Karla wiped her tears. "Baby, that family was already cracked. You just showed them the light." That afternoon, during a therapy session, Elly pulled out a new piece of paper. She drew another tree. This one had thicker roots, more colors. Karla's name was at the center. Around it were branches, Rosa Joy, the investigator, even Linda, the lawyer. Her therapist. Mr. Elephant, the plush toy. Then carefully, Elly wrote, "Elly, I choose to be in my own tree." Her therapist, watching, asked gently, "What does that feel like?" Elly smiled, like breathing. But the world wasn't done listening. 3 days later, Karla received a call from a local art nonprofit. They wanted to feature Elly's drawings as part of a child healing and identity exhibit. Karla hesitated. She is still fragile. She's also powerful, the woman on the phone said. Her story could help so many others. They said it could be anonymous, but Elly surprised them all. I want people to see it, she said. I want other kids to know they can draw their own trees too. So they did. The exhibit opened with her video on a loop. Elly, in soft lighting, held her tree drawing. She looked into the camera, then smiled and said, "My name is Elly, and even if you erase me, I can always write myself back in." The room fell silent. A new kind of silence. One of reckoning, one of awe. Back at the Henderson estate, the gates stayed shut. Reporters parked at a distance. The lights in the West Wing never came on. Whispers said Helen left town, that Thomas was getting help, that Elena refused interviews, and Robert was reviewing the trust in private. But it didn't matter anymore, because the story no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the little girl who taught the world that love wasn't blood or inheritance or the shape of your last name. It was the courage to say, "I am enough, I always was." The therapist's office smelled like cinnamon tea and old books. Elly sat on the padded chair legs, tucked underneath her eyes, fixed on a speck on the wall. A blue journal lay on the table in front of her untouched. Her hands stayed folded tightly in her lap. It had been 3 weeks since the court ruling, 4 since Karla walked out of the Henderson estate. And now, twice a week, Karla brought Elly to this quiet room with muted colors where a woman named Dana never asked too many questions. Dana never pushed. She waited. Elly hadn't spoken a full sentence in sessions since they began. But she came. That was something. The first time she touched the crayons again, it was on a Thursday afternoon. Dana placed the tray beside her, as she always did, then returned to her chair. She opened a book, pretended not to notice. Elly didn't look at Dana. She just picked a green crayon and started drawing a spiral in the corner of a blank page. Then a line. Then another. 20 silent minutes later, she held up a picture of the ocean. Wild. Crashing. But beautiful. "Is that where you want to go?" Dana asked gently. Elly nodded. That night, Karla found the drawing in Elly's bag. She studied the jagged waves, the way they overlapped in shades of navy and silver and stormy green. And then, in the corner, small but unmistakable, a girl on the beach holding a kite. Karla kissed her daughter's forehead and made a decision. The next day she turned in her resignation. Her manager tried to convince her otherwise. "You're one of the best nurses we have, Karla." "I'll be back," she said softly. "Just not now." And so she packed 2 suitcases, filled the tank of her used Honda, and took Elly on a road trip south past the city through old highways and sleepy coastal towns until the salt air filled their lungs. They arrived in a town so small, the local grocery store doubled as a post office. Karla found them a cottage white wood, a blue door, and a view of the sea that Elly had painted without even knowing it. There was no internet, no television, just the ocean, the sand, and silence. The good kind. They spent mornings walking along the shoreline, collecting shells and bits of sea glass. Afternoons were for books, baking, and naps in hammocks. But it was the evenings that changed everything. At sunset, Karla would light 2 candles, set out 2 journals, and sit at the kitchen table with Elly. "This is our truth time," she'd say. "Whatever you want to write, or draw, or say." Some nights, Elly just scribbled. Other nights, she asked questions like, "Do jellyfish feel lonely?" Or, "If we name a star, does it know?" And sometimes, "Itchai? Itchai," she cried. Not the kind of crying that asked for fixing. The kind that finally trusted she could fall apart and still be loved. On the 23rd night, Elly wrote a poem. It was short, simple. "If I was a tree, I'd grow sideways so I could see the ocean." Karla cried reading it, not because it was sad, but because it was hers. A voice returning, softly, bravely, alive. They built rituals. Every Sunday, they painted each other's nails, even if it chipped by Monday. On Tuesdays, they picked a new word to learn. Elly chose anchorage one week, and Karla chose resilience the next. On Fridays, they cooked dinner together, even if it meant burnt rice or flour on the ceiling. Karla noticed the light returning to Elly's eyes, not all at once, but in flickers. Like a dawn sneaking through a storm cloud. One afternoon, Elly ran in from the yard, holding a snail shell. "His name is Miso," she announced. And Karla, without missing a beat, said, "Well, Mr. Miso is welcome to dinner." But it wasn't all healing and sunsets. There were nightmares. Still, some nights, Elly screamed in her sleep. She'd wake up gasping, clutching her blanket eyes, wild with leftover fear. Once she whispered, "They said if I don't act right, I'll disappear." Karla held her close. "You will never disappear again." Another time, Elly asked, "If they see me smile, will they come take it back?" Karla whispered, "Your smile is safe here." Then came the moment. One rainy evening, while thunder rumbled in the distance and the ocean roared like a wild orchestra, Elly sat cross-legged at the journal table. She looked up from her page. "Mama," Karla turned startled. Elly hadn't called her that in weeks. Sometimes she said Mom, sometimes nothing. But this felt like childhood returning home. "Yes, baby? Can we?" "Can we make our own family tree?" Karla's heart swelled. "We already have one. But really draw it. Just ours." "Of course." She fetched paper markers tea. Together, they sat at the table while rain traced paths down the windows. Elly started with Karla's name at the root, then added herself, then Mr. Elephant, because she said he was with me even when I cried in the closet. They added Joy the investigator, Dana the therapist, even Miso the snail. Anyone who stayed Elly whispered. Then at the bottom she paused. "Can I ask something?" she said. "Anything." Elly looked up, her voice barely audible. "Mama, can I be in your family tree? Your real one?" Karla leaned across the table. She didn't cry. She didn't make a speech. She just reached for Elly's hand, pressed it to her heart, and said, "You are the root of mine." Elly smiled. And in that moment, Karla knew it was over. Not the grief, not the scars. Those would linger. But the battle to prove Elly belonged, that was done. Because Elly no longer needed anyone else's permission. She had rewritten herself into the story. And this time, no one could erase her. The stage was small, just a wooden platform beneath a modest canopy dressed with paper lanterns and hand-painted banners. It stood at the center of a community park in a coastal town where the waves could be heard from the edge of the playground. Folding chairs dotted the grass. Most were filled with parents, social workers, volunteers, people who had carried children through storms. And today they had gathered for the Voices of Resilience ceremony, an annual event honoring children who had survived what no child should. At the front row sat Karla, hands clasped tight, eyes locked on the stage where Elly stood. 12 years old now, but still small for her age. She wore a pale yellow dress with stitched sunflowers and scuffed white shoes. Her hair was braided loosely, a few strands falling across her cheek as she leaned toward the microphone. The audience quieted. Elly looked down at the page she had folded and refolded for days. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice, when it came, was clear. "Hi! My name is Elly Winters," she began. "I used to think that family was a place where everyone had the same last name, or the same blood. I thought I didn't belong because I was adopted, because I came from sadness, because I was told I was not really one of them." She paused. Somewhere in the audience, someone whispered a sharp breath. "But I've learned that sometimes people try to erase you, not because you're weak, but because you remind them of everything they tried to hide." Elly glanced toward her mother. "I was locked out in the rain once," she continued, "because I colored on something I wasn't supposed to. I was wearing a dress with stars. I remember thinking, maybe if I shiver long enough, they'll let me back in." She looked up again. "But then, I met people who let me in without knocking." Tears slipped down Karla's face, silent and steady. "I still have dreams about the cold," Elly said. "But now when I wake up, I know I'm home. Because family isn't just a name. It's the place where you don't feel cold even when it's raining." The crowd didn't clap immediately. They were too stunned, too moved. Then the applause erupted. And Karla stood not because it was expected, but because her daughter had just shattered the silence of 100 unspoken stories. The next morning, Karla returned home to find a package leaning against the front door. It was flat, wrapped in brown paper, no return address. She brought it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and slowly peeled back the tape. Inside was a professionally printed chart. The Henderson family tree, 3 generations, dozens of names, birth years, marriage lines, dignified fonts. Karla stared at it for a long moment. Her eyes traced the branches, Thomas's name, his cousins, his parents, his deceased grandfather for whom the family trust was named. And then the space where there should have been a line, where Elly's name had once been legally, now erased, as if she had never existed. There was no note, no apology, no explanation, just that cold emptiness on paper. Karla didn't cry. She didn't shred it. She simply stood, walked to her living room, and took down a frame that hung above the bookshelf. A smaller handmade tree drawn in watercolor by Elly months earlier. At the bottom, in neat calligraphy, Karla had once written Winter's family. Began with love, grows with choice. But something was missing. She took a black pen, drew a new branch, and wrote in bold, flowing letters, Elly Marie Winters, daughter, survivor, root of everything. Then beneath it, a sentence, "Family is who stays when the storm comes." That evening, the sky turned silver with rain again. Elly sat by the window, curled beneath her favorite blanket, reading a book about galaxies. Outside, the drops hit the glass in steady rhythm. "Mama," she said softly. Karla looked up from the couch. "Yes." Elly didn't say anything at first, just stared out at the storm. Then in a voice just above a whisper, "Do you think people can grow even if they're broken?" Karla got up, walked over, and sat beside her daughter. She wrapped an arm around her. "I don't think we grow despite being broken," she said. "I think we grow because we are." Elly leaned her head on her shoulder. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain. Then Karla said, "Want to know a secret?" Elly nodded. "I think the most beautiful trees are the ones that bend and crack and stretch toward the light anyway." A small smile tugged at Elly's lips. Outside, the wind picked up, and the thunder rumbled softly, like a memory fading. The story didn't end there. It never does. There were still nights where Elly woke up crying. Still moments where a sound or a smell triggered something old and dark. Still questions she wasn't ready to ask, and answers Karla didn't always have. But they had books, and sunsets, and journals filled with drawings. And every night before bed, Karla whispered the same line, "You are not what they tried to make you forget. You are what you chose to remember." Elly began writing her own book. Not a diary, a real one, about a girl who was erased, who rewrote her name, and made the world remember her. Because sometimes healing isn't loud. It doesn't look like victory. It looks like a quiet morning, a pencil on paper, a hand holding another through the dark. It looks like a name rewritten in ink, not to be proven, but to be claimed.